The axe was still in the house when they found the bodies, wiped clean and set against the wall, as though whoever swung it wanted to be certain no one would miss it. Welcome back to Real Ghost Chatter. I'm Marianne Paul, and I'm so glad you're here. Settle in wherever you are, pour something warm, and keep a light on if you like, because the story I have for you is one of the most unsettling this country has never managed to solve. It happened in a small farmhouse in southwest Iowa, where 8 people lay down to sleep one summer night, and not one of them woke up. More than 100 years have passed, and we still don't know who did it. By many accounts, the story didn't end when the trail went cold. Stay close. Let me start with what we know for certain, because this story needs no embellishment. It is terrible enough on its own. In June of 1912, Josiah and Sarah Moore lived in the little town of Villisca, Iowa, with their 4 children. Josiah ran a good business selling farm implements. Sarah kept the house and raised the children, and by every account, they were an ordinary, well-liked family in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, for better and worse. On the evening of June 9th, the whole family went to a children's program at the Presbyterian Church, and afterward, 2 young sisters, Lena and Ina Stillinger, came home with them to spend the night. It was a small kindness, the sort of thing that happens in a close community without a second thought. Sarah tucked the visiting girls in alongside her own, and no one under that roof had reason to believe the night would be anything but ordinary. Sometime after midnight, someone came into the Moore house. We know that not from anyone hearing it, but from what was left behind. The neighbors reported nothing at all that night. No scream, no struggle, no dog barking in the yard, which means whoever did this moved through those rooms with a patient and horrible quiet. By the time the sun came up, all 8 people inside were dead. Josiah, Sarah, their 4 children, and both Stillinger sisters had been killed in their beds with an axe, the family's own axe, the one Josiah kept out in the barn. Whoever used it covered the faces of the dead and went through the house, draping cloth over every mirror and one window. There was a pan of bloody water left sitting in the kitchen, and a plate of food on the table that no one had touched. These were real people with real families who loved and grieved them for the rest of their lives, and this has never been entertainment to me. But it is also a crime that was never solved, and the not knowing is a large part of why it has stayed with this country for more than a century. The people trying to solve it faced a problem hard to imagine now. No careful forensic process, no real method for protecting a crime scene, and a local sheriff overwhelmed by something no one in that town had ever seen. In the hours after the bodies were found, dozens of people walked straight through the house, some on official business, some drawn by pure curiosity, and whatever evidence might have pointed to the killer was almost certainly trampled away by morning. Over the next 2 decades, suspicion landed on more than 20 different people. A traveling minister named George Kelly confessed years later, saying he'd been driven to it by religious compulsion. But 2 separate juries heard the case, and neither would convict. A state senator's name came up. A local farmhand was investigated and then cleared. Decades on, a theory took hold tying Villisca to a string of similar axe murders across the country, laid out most fully in a book called The Man from the Train. That theory is one of the more chilling pieces of research to come out of this case in recent years. The authors found more than a dozen similar attacks across several states, a pattern that's enough to raise the hair on your arms. Whole families killed with an axe that belonged to the household, every victim struck while asleep, mirrors or windows covered afterward, and the weapon left behind at the scene rather than carried away. If that pattern holds, and many researchers believe it does, whoever walked into the Moore house may have done this many times before and after, moving quietly from town to town along the rail lines, never once caught. It turns a single unsolved tragedy into something far larger and more frightening, and it's part of why researchers keep coming back to Villisca even now. But laid out in all its careful detail, it still proved nothing, and no one was ever convicted for what happened inside that house on 2nd Street. That's the true crime half of the story, harrowing enough on its own. But it didn't stop there. When the investigation went cold, a different kind of story was only getting started. The house itself is still standing, restored to look almost exactly as it did in 1912, down to the furniture and the layout of every room. Today it runs as a museum where you can take a guided tour by daylight, or, if your nerves are up to it, book the whole house for a night. And it's those overnight guests who've made this one of the most talked about haunted places in the country. Here's what people actually describe, where the story turns from history into something harder to explain. Visitors say the house feels different from one room to the next, almost as though the building itself remembers what happened inside it. The children's bedroom is the one nearly everyone singles out. People describe a wave of dread the moment they step through the door, sometimes before they've even fully entered. More than one visitor, with no knowledge of what the others said, has described hearing what sounds like children laughing up in the attic, and that lands harder once you remember 6 of the 8 who died there were under the age of 12. Doors are said to open and close on their own, sometimes softly, sometimes hard enough to scatter a whole tour group. Toys guests leave in the children's room are said to move between visits, sliding across the floor or turning up somewhere else entirely. One caretaker described finding a toy car that had been sitting upright on an old stove, suddenly flipped upside down, in a room no one had entered. Paranormal investigators have carried all manner of equipment into the house, from instruments that measure electromagnetic fields to sensitive audio recorders, hoping to catch something measurable instead of merely felt. And by most accounts, they have. There's a phenomenon investigators call an EVP, electronic voice phenomena, a voice or sound that turns up on a recording even though no one in the room heard it. At Villisca, investigators say they've captured what sounds like two-way conversation this way, voices answering the very questions they asked out loud. One recording passed around a great deal is said to catch a raspy, unplaceable voice speaking 3 words: "Pick up that axe." Whether that strikes you as convincing or as coincidence depends on how open you already are. And that's a fair place to stand. The attic has a reputation all its own. Investigators believe the killer may have hidden up there, waiting for the household to fall asleep. And visitors describe the space as heavier and more oppressive than anywhere else, with some saying they've seen shadowy shapes shifting just past where a flashlight can reach. Perhaps the most unsettling account of all involves a paranormal investigator who, in 2014, brought a hunting knife into the house against the caretaker's plain warning. By the reports, he was trying to provoke a reaction from whatever might be there, and he was later found wounded badly enough to need a hospital, with no clear memory of how it happened. I pass that along not to claim something supernatural caused it, but because it's exactly the kind of thing no one can explain, and it keeps drawing people back, one generation after another. It's appeared on more paranormal television programs than I can count, including one well-known night when a team left saying they'd recorded 2 separate presences, one of which they called borderline demonic. Guests have come away with photographs that seem to show orbs of light, fog drifting through closed rooms, and shadowy figures no one saw when the picture was taken. And even on an ordinary daytime tour, with sunlight in the windows, visitors still feel a sudden wave of sadness or anger for no reason they can name. Some leave with nothing more than a good story and a bad case of nerves. Others leave certain that something in that house is still present, still aware, and still deeply unsettled by what happened there in the early hours of June 10th, 1912. I want to pause here for a moment. If you're drawn to tales where the darkness is real, but the light is stronger still, you'd feel right at home in my Raven's Cove Iconoclast series. It's 6 supernatural thrillers where ordinary people find themselves standing between their neighbors and a very real darkness. Written in the spirit of Frank Peretti's This Present Darkness, but a bit creepier. You can find the whole series on Amazon.com, MariannePole.com, or wherever good books are sold. Now, back to Villisca. So where does that leave us? A case that produced no confession that held up, no conviction, and no resolution for a family and 2 young guests who never should have lost their lives, and a house that, by every account we have, hasn't been quiet since. I keep circling back to a question that comes up on nearly every episode of this show. Why some places hold on to a tragedy like this, while others, just as terrible, let it go without a trace. I don't have a tidy answer, and I'm not sure anyone does. But there's something to the idea that violence this sudden, this complete, and this unresolved leaves a mark that ordinary time doesn't wear away. What I keep noticing with this house is how much of what people report centers on the children. Not vague, generic haunting, but the sound of young laughter, and toys that won't stay where they were left, and dread that gathers most heavily in the very room where the youngest victims died. If you believe in some imprint left behind by a sudden death, this is about as clear a pattern as you'll find anywhere. 6 children killed in their sleep in the one place on earth that was supposed to be safe for them. It would almost be stranger if that house felt like nothing at all. And I think about the parents, too. Josiah and Sarah Moore died in a house full of children, 2 of whom weren't even their own, taken in for the night out of plain neighborly kindness. If there's any version of the world to come where a parent's instinct to shield their children carries on past death, then I believe Sarah and Josiah are somewhere in that house still, even if the stories tend to fix on the little ones. I want to be honest with you, the way I try to be every week. I can't tell you for certain the Villisca house is haunted. I wasn't there, and all I can do is carry these accounts the way I would if someone described something strange from their own home. But these reports come from people with no connection to one another, spread across many decades, with no obvious reason to lie, and plenty of skeptics among them. And that's not easy to wave away. There's a fair skeptical case to make, too, and it deserves its place here. Old farmhouses creak, foundations settle, beans shift with the seasons, and any of it can sound remarkably like a footstep in the dark. A visitor who already knows the history is primed, whether they realize it or not, to read an ordinary draft as a cold spot and an old hinge as something far stranger. Suggestion is a powerful thing, and a house with this reputation carries 100 years of it built into every board. I raise that not to dismiss anyone who has felt something real in that place, but because honest curiosity means holding both possibilities at once, rather than settling for the most exciting explanation. Maybe it's both. Maybe a house can be haunted by its history and by something more at once. And maybe we don't need to fully pull the two apart to feel the weight of either one. There's one more detail from this case that I turn over more than any other. Easy to miss if you only skim the surface. The killer covered every mirror in that house before leaving. Historians and investigators have offered a few explanations over the years. Some point to an old superstition, the belief that a soul can be caught in a mirror's reflection at the moment of death, and that covering the glass was meant to keep the spirits of the dead from lingering. Others think it was simply a killer who couldn't bear to catch sight of his own face. Either way is unsettling, and neither has ever been proven. But it tells you how deliberately this was carried out, how much thought went into details that had nothing to do with the killing itself. Whoever did this took time inside that house they didn't need to take, time they could have spent getting away, and instead spent it on rituals that, a century later, we're still trying to understand. If you ever find yourself in southwest Iowa, the house is still there, restored down to the smallest detail, with tours running several days a week for anyone curious enough to see it. Just know that if you choose to stay the night, you'll be sleeping in the very rooms where it happened, and by nearly every account we have, you may not be sleeping alone. Before I let you go, I want to say the thing I believe with my whole heart. Even in a story this dark, the darkness doesn't get the last word. This case was never closed in any courtroom, and it may never be. But there is an old and steadying promise that nothing stays hidden forever, and that what no jury could uncover isn't, in the end, truly unknown. The words I want to leave with you come from the Gospel of Luke, the 8th chapter, the 17th verse. For nothing is secret that shall not be made manifest, neither anything hid that shall not be known and come abroad. Whatever happened inside that farmhouse, and whoever walked back into the dark afterward, it's not hidden from the one who sees all things. And for the 8 souls who died there, that's its own kind of justice and its own kind of light. Until next time, may you walk in the light. May your own home be a place of peace. And may whatever follows you home from a story like this one be nothing more than a good tale to tell.
The supernatural world is closer than we think. Sometimes it chills us. Sometimes it reminds us we were never alone. 2 worlds, every single day. And the greatest power against the darkness has always been the light. Stay curious, stay faithful, and never mistake the darkness for the whole story. Thanks for listening. Until next time, may the sun always be on your face, the wind at your back, and the good Lord walk beside you.